Capacity Building Stories is a podcast series brought to you by the Paris Committee on Capacity Buildings Network, in short, the PCCB Network. Through these episodes, we aim to create a space for capacity building experts, practitioners, and enthusiasts of the PCCB network to share their work, experiences, and best practices around climate-related capacity building. We hope to turn this wealth of knowledge, experience, and inspiration into learning opportunities for a wider circle of capacity building actors and ultimately into more impactful climate action. My name is Riddhi Dutta, and my pronouns are she, her. Both as your host and the coordinator of the PCCB network, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our audience to this first episode. As our world becomes increasingly globalized and complex, so does the problem of climate change. There is a need to turn to interdisciplinary approaches and of building capacities at all levels in order to combat climate change. In today's episode, we look at climate-related capacity building and the climate action space through the gender lens. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our guest, Jeannette. Could you please introduce yourself and the organization that you represent?
Thank you so much, Riddhi, for this opportunity. Yes, WOCAN, which stands for Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management, is a women-led international membership network of women and men professionals and women's associations engaged in agriculture and natural resource management. We have about over 1,400 members in 114 countries at this time. And our work and our mission is to advance women's empowerment and collective action in order to tackle climate change, poverty, and food insecurity within enabling environments. So we build capacities of organizations at all and individuals at all levels to incorporate gender into their programs, but also incorporate gender into the institutional cultures and policies of the organizations that are engaging in this climate-related sectors. So we provide training and coaching also in women's leadership, again, at all levels, from women's groups to organizations. In addition, we manage the W+ standard, and we provide technical assistance for designing, measuring, and monitoring women's empowerment using the W+ standard, which I'll talk about a little more later, for organizations, for companies, for projects that seek to quantify their impacts on women's empowerment. And lastly, we're currently developing a project in Hawaii, where I'm based, to pilot innovations and practices to achieve climate and economic resilience for women farmers who live here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure for us to have you on board. And thank you so much for your introduction as well. So WOCAN is a member of the PCCB network. And for our audience that might not know what this network is, the PCCB network is designed as a voluntary association of interested stakeholders engaged in climate-related capacity building, who can then share information on good practices of their work, contribute to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate, and connect with peers across sectors and regions. Of course, from Jeannette's sort of introduction, we saw that WOCAN also works across all sectors and regions. But I'd like to ask you a question on what does capacity building look like in terms of your work?
So that's a good question. So we work in gender integration, or some people may say gender mainstreaming. So in primarily, because again, as I stress, the mission of WOCAN focuses also on building the enabling conditions to allow for gender equality and women's empowerment. And so for that reason, a lot of our focus is on the institutions themselves, because we feel that although there's a lot of focus on grassroots organizations and things happening at the project level, what we understand is unless there's support for that at the institutional level, it often doesn't happen. So we work to do that kind of gender integrated planning, and measurement and monitoring of results, So that's with government agencies, multilateral institutions, UN agencies, NGOs, research organizations, funders and foundations, and project developers of climate mitigation adaptation projects. To give you an example of this, two examples. We recently did a training and a coaching for this kind of gender integration into REDD+ agencies working in Madagascar and Cote d'Ivoire. And that was done through the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank. And just last week, we did a gender integrated planning training for Pakistan's Ministry of Climate Change and REDD+ division.
Perfect. So a lot happening on WOCAN's front. But this brings me to my next question. What is the status quo of gender responsiveness and inclusion in the climate action landscape, specifically in capacity building efforts?
I think there's a lot of good news, Riddhi, to report on this. I mean, so WOCAN, along with only a few other perhaps women-led advocacy organizations, have been really advocating for, I would say, a decade to try to get gender into climate-related organizations and funds. It takes a long time, but it's really interesting. I think within the last year and a half, we've seen something's turned. And it's now much more common to be discussing things that are at the nexus of gender and climate. Whereas before, we were talking to both groups, gender proponents as well as climate proponents, and them not being really able to see the link between the two. And I think that's changed. And so I think we should be proud of the fact that right now, a lot of the big climate funds, the GCF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, the Adaptation Fund, other funds are requiring gender action plans be prepared. To varying degrees, those funds are enforcing those policies. That's still the area to be worked on. But there is a very large awareness and a lot of push now to get capacity building, at least, and policies about gender into the climate funds. Also, I want to say that there's, from that side, from the climate side, from the gender side, I think in the last year we've seen much more interest by gender lens investors and other impact investors who we've always tried to work at both levels to get gender into climate and climate into gender. In many ways, it's been easier to get gender into climate than it has been to get climate into gender, which may surprise some people. But I think we're finally there, and there's a lot of interest in the nexus of these two sectors now.
It's really nice to know that the linkages are becoming more and more evident, and a lot of work is being going on. And we've gotten very far from where we've started many, many years ago. But I'd love to know, what are some of the most pressing capacity building gaps and needs pertaining to gender inclusion and gender responsiveness?
Yep, this is an excellent opportunity to talk about this, because although we've made some progress, we have to continually be reflecting on what's the level of that progress and what's left to do. So I'm going to say here that for us, what we find is that most of the gender actions within these gender action plans, for example, are not transformative. They are, I don't want to sound too negative about this, but sometimes they're only for a box checking type of exercise to prove to the donor, for example, that you put in the usual paragraph, or maybe it's less than that, a sentence about gender. But what we mean by transformative is it has to go beyond changing just women's conditions, but also their status. And here, understanding the difference between changing conditions and changing status is where organizations need to have gender skills and knowledge. That's the kind of thing we teach. And so most, again, is the other big gap we find is that it's about benefit sharing, right? So those action plans may be laying out activities, and it's usually training, or maybe it's the provision of cook stoves or things like this. But we really need to talk about how these kind of projects that are bringing concrete results to communities also look at the benefit sharing that goes on, and how much women gain within that process. And that becomes increasingly important as, for example, projects are generating and selling carbon credits, and then what part of that comes back to the community. We find even in the funds that are dealing with gender action plans, there is a lack of linkage to the benefit sharing plan that same fund is doing. So we will find benefit sharing plans that make no mention of how women are going to be. And so when the money comes down to the table, that's where we often don't see women. So that's a big gap. The other thing is, in general, we see low levels of accountability. This is, in other words, what I often say is, doing gender doesn't often matter enough. There's not enough of a stick or a carrot to push that kind of gender action plans, for example. So donors need to require that. It's often not really a serious requirement, but it's also related to the fact that the way results are measured or not measured. So if the measurement system is relying on simply reporting on inputs and outputs, which is still where most of the reporting lies. For example, how many women were trained? But what we will argue is that's not the metric that we're interested in. We want to know, okay, X number of women are trained for what? What was the actual result of training those women? So donors and funders need to require that kind of accountability. And that's another area of capacity building need. We see that there is still a lack of capacity within projects and organizations to measure results. Gender experts themselves are often, we find, not capable of this kind of measurement of results. This is also an area where you need to use some creative thinking about what are you looking for? What are your indicators? And what are you looking for in order to see the results? For example, if you're training in women's leadership, what is the result you're looking for? Is it the fact that women are more active in community organizations? Can we look at the minutes of meetings to determine where women are proposing new initiatives and things like this? So it's a new area even for monitoring and evaluation experts. The last point I will make that we still need work on is champions. Particularly to create this kind of enabling environment within these very male-dominated institutions, requires not only women gender champions, but also, even at least as importantly, male gender champions who can push for this kind of change inside the institutions. These people are often not senior managers. Senior managers tend to be more focused on keeping business as usual. We need people who are actual change agents, and they need to be working in institutions that recognize that reward that type of change, encourage that initiatives. And so again, if gender doesn't matter much to those climate-related policies, programs, narratives, and institutions, it becomes very, very difficult environment for champions to push for the kind of changes that are required. So we need to be not only doing capacity building for change and change agents, but also change agents need networks. They need coaching. They need people who listen to the kind of challenges that they face every day.
Right. Those were some really interesting gaps that are, that have to be filled. And given that WOCAN works with such gaps, sort of meets such needs, could you give us such examples from some of your recent projects of how WOCAN sort of pivots in terms of meeting these gaps and needs?
Yeah, I think so. So for us, really, the biggest way we pivoted was in about 2014, 2015, when we created this W+ standard. So I'd like to say we did this to meet three gaps. Number one was this lack of accountability that I referred to, that gender was just a checking the box exercise, and that we felt it needed to be based on a results-based mechanism. So that was the first reason we created W+ standard. Second one is to drive more resources and more action through what we saw an opportunity, particularly related to climate mitigation projects that could be doing so much more for women and for gender equality, but simply weren't. So we said, again, how do we make it matter? How do we, and we realized we needed to incentivize that kind of change. So we decided to use a market-based approach to incentivize and make it profitable for those projects who could bring those kind of benefits to women. And then the third one is to address this benefit sharing aspect, which we feel at WOCAN is the most critical need, is to drive new sources of funding and resources to women's groups, women's collective, women-led businesses at the grassroots level, which are critically underfunded. And we thought, can we use a market-based mechanism to share benefits to enable that kind of new capital to flow? So we created this W plus standard, which there's too much to say about that here, but just suffice to say that it's really the world's first certification system, very similar to a measurement of carbon, same kind of rigor and transparency that enables a project developer to measure and quantify the level of women's empowerment, and then be able to create this tradable asset, which is a W plus credit, which has a monetary value. Again, that's back to the incentive and the benefit sharing aspect of the standard. So I think an example of this is the best one I can think of is the one we did actually at WOCAN, for which we won the UNFCCC Momentum for Change Women for Results Award in 2016. And I talk about this because I think this is a classic case. It was the case of a biogas project being implemented across the country by Nepal, parastatal agency in Nepal, and it was generating carbon credits, selling carbon credits to Europe, and doing great work. And on the side, creating transformational change for women whose lives were changed significantly by the fact they no longer had to walk to the forest to cut down trees. They had clean kitchens, and there's multiple other impacts that result. But the climate project developer, the government, was not measuring that impact. So it was like an unanticipated impact, perhaps, but it was significant. So we measured time saving for women, which is 2.5 hours per day, every day in their lives. And that's the only thing we just measured. And then we generated those W plus credits from that, sold those credits, some of them, and then returned the amount back to women's groups in those communities. And then women's groups in those communities use that funding to pay for water supply systems, to diversify their agriculture, to add to their savings and loans programs, et cetera. So I think there are going to be many, many other projects like that are also generating these kind of transformative benefits, or could be, with just a little bit of tweaking of the design of their project. I think there could be much more of this.
That is wonderful. I mean, 2.5 hours is a lot of time. And what I'd like to also find out is, what was one outcome from that program that you didn't expect at all?
Okay, here's where I can be brutally honest with myself. So I think, we sort of saw this W plus as this is the perfect answer to corporates who have net zero goals, for example, corporates and funders who say they have ESG investing ambitions, who are also saying that, we're lacking the metrics to measure social impacts. And, the W plus, we did all that. The W plus is a metric to measure this. We've been through its existence since 2015. We've won awards. It's operationalized. It's got a proof of concept. It's out there. But there's still so many people and so many organizations who are unaware of this. No matter, we're a small organization. We do our best, but we can't get the word out to enough people. So that's one thing. But I think that the true thing is, it's been really difficult to build that market and the market demand for these credits. It's just, maybe it's too difficult for people to understand that in the same way you can monetize carbon emissions, you can also monetize social impact. We've also found that there is been a lot of interest. Everyone we talk to says, oh, that's creative, it's brilliant, et cetera, but they don't buy into it. And then we've even heard from some people that they're waiting for others to go first. And so we've learned something called the first mover disadvantage, which I had no knowledge of before. I thought people would want to be the first and would want to be leaders, but many people are in corporates and others are a bit risk adverse. So they wait for somebody else to go first. So that, and the other thing that surprised me, Riddhi, is that it would take such a long time. Like I said, I think it's taken 10 years for both the climate and the gender communities to become aware of this nexus and to go and see beyond the women as victims narrative, which is the one you commonly hear. And you have an image in your mind of some poor woman in Bangladesh in a sari who's caught in a tree in a flood because she can't swim. This is not a useful image. And it also puts women into this position of being kind of charity victims of something. It doesn't allow, and there's no money or there's no support. Who wants to fund that, right? Instead, let's look at women as the solution, women as active agents of change, and let's provide funding and resources to enable them to do that better. The last thing I'll say that surprised me was we recently did a survey, and it's not exhaustive, but we've been asking around for a long time, where are the climate projects, mitigation projects, particularly those engaging in carbon markets? Where are those projects that are run by women, either women's groups or women-led companies? And the answer is there are apparently very, very few. And I think that surprised me as well. Knowing there's tremendous opportunities, for example, in carbon markets, why aren't women-led businesses acquiring the skills and engaging in that very lucrative, perhaps, opportunity to fund their businesses?
I see that we've spoken about many, many gaps, and there's like a whole room for improvement, and that room just keeps somehow growing as the days pass. And I love that you mentioned the first movers disadvantage, but I'd like to reframe that a little bit, and then let's look at it as an opportunity, a learning opportunity, and low-hanging fruits, right? So given that we've spoken about all of these gaps, what are some of the very easily filled gaps that you see, and what are those related opportunities over there?
Well, so one of this is I think this gap in capacity development for all sorts of types of organizations involved in climate, including women-led enterprise. That's kind of a new component here, but we need to bridge that gap. We need to, for example, get women's organizations aware of carbon markets as one form of climate finance, not the only one. But it's out there, it's existing. It's what you said. Let's tap into it. It's a well-known, it works, right? In some way, there's a lot of problems with it that people are trying to improve on. But if we could get women's groups engaging in that and driving some of those profits to help women's organizations, that could also mitigate against some of the negative complaints against carbon markets. So there's opportunities right there into training people how to measure, training women how to measure carbon and the W+ so that they can engage in this. I think that whole climate finance provides new windows of opportunities. All of this new interest, for example, in gender lens impact investors who are looking for what is the right project? What does a good project look like? That's the question they ask. What does a good project look like that's at the nexus of gender and climate? So we have to show that to them again. Once again, we have to create pilot projects and other things that can very clearly demonstrate. And here's the key. If we can demonstrate how investors can gain a return on their investment, not only provide grants to NGOs and women's groups, but to show how there could be a modest return. For example, we would be able to vastly enlarge the number of people who are supporting this initiative. I think that's possible. And yeah, I think that those are the primary things. I think that this big uptake in carbon markets, I know there's a lot of criticism, but we have to face the fact that net zero goals are the huge driving force right now in a lot of the corporate private sector world. Let's enable that movement to do good by using things that are existing and already out there.
Perfect. Those are a lot of ideas for our listeners to possibly tap into and explore further. And it's been absolutely a wonderful sort of learning in a very short span of time what the body of work of WOCAN and your work looks like. So I think in terms of making connections, this is where, as the PCCB Network Coordinator, I would just like to thank you, because when we were sort of envisioning this entire podcast series and like sort of brainstorming what that series would look like, we actually came across WOCAN's podcast. And I think this is the perfect time to ask you about what that podcast was. I mean, I know about it, but I'd love for all the listeners to get to know about it a little bit and perhaps even listen to it, because it's amazing episodes. So I'll let you take the floor, Jeannette. Please tell us more about WOCAN's podcast.
So we started thinking about, we want to focus on solutions. We find that even at this gender and climate nexus, there's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of rationalization of it, but we know it's getting late. There's an urgency around climate. And if we've got solutions, we really need to get those out there and share those. So we thought about this and we thought, can we identify solutions for what we're calling feminist climate resilient recovery? And this was done last year during COVID, when again, there's such a focus on recovery. And so we came up with 10 solutions. And for each of those solutions, we associated with someone we know, a leader, in most cases women, but there are a couple men in there, that can talk about their solutions that we would call feminist solutions to this. And so this is a podcast called 10 Solutions for Feminist Climate Resilient Recovery. It's on the website of WOCAN, and it's getting lots and lots of hits. It just keeps on giving. We'll never take it off because it seems that it's increasingly being discovered. So I think that's been a very positive thing to push.
And for sure, we have learned so much from it as well. Like I mentioned, when we came across the podcast, we listened to it, and that only, like you said, it's a gift that keeps giving, right? And even though there are like updates to the climate space and the gender space and the linkages, but then some things are just timeless, and just the structure of how this podcast was built did give us a lot of inspiration. We did learn from that podcast as well. So I would highly recommend anyone to check that podcast out. But besides that, I would love to ask you how our listeners could sort of get involved with WOCAN's work.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great opportunity. And I think your point is a good one. We should keep adding more and more solutions to the podcast as we keep coming up with them. But one of the easy ways is, of course, you can actually purchase W Plus units. So right even through our website, there's a purchase W Plus unit button, I think. And that we actually have units. Again, we're monetizing and selling those units. And the one that WOCAN owns is that related to the Nepal biogas project that I spoke of. So there's a way that individuals can purchase units on the website. That money then goes directly to the women's groups in Nepal to further their support for this work. Also, I want to mention, it's not yet out there, but we are soon starting up a fund that's going to be used to finance new climate projects, especially those run by women, as I'm talking about. And that would provide skill training on how to measure carbon and women's empowerment and teach women's organizations how to engage in carbon markets. We are also spinning off a new brokerage company, small, that will actually do the sales of those units. So to provide that as a way for people to engage as well. And also there's just to generally contribute to WOCAN and donate to us. We're a small, very sort of poorly funded, like most women's organizations, working with huge, big ideas and very small pockets. So any contribution is also very much appreciated.
Well, here's to bigger and more ideas and bigger pockets, filled pockets, Thank you so much, Jeannette, for being a part of this episode. It has been a wonderful conversation. I have personally learned so much, but that's what I say every time I speak to you. I hope our audience enjoyed it as well. But yeah, thank you again for all of your work. And we look forward to seeing what WOCAN has in store in the climate and gender world.
Thank you very much, Riddhi.